Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to see you all here. Welcome to the Jesuit Center's last Formations and Reformations in Catholic Thought lunch hour lecture series. The last one of the term, I should say. We've got new ones planned in the new year. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the acting director for the year, Meredith Bacola. And before I introduce our speaker today, I'd like to begin by acknowledging with gratitude and humility that the University of Manitoba campuses, as well as our college here at St. Paul's, is located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dene, and Dakota peoples, and the homeland of the Red River Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories, the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to moving forward in partnership with communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. I've long wanted to meet today's speaker, Dr. Hilary Kaell. She is an associate professor of anthropology and religion from McGill University in Montreal, where she holds a William Dawson Research Chair. She writes about North American Christians, often focusing on how Christians make and imagine global connections. And I first came across Dr. Kaell's work when considering readings for a pilgrimage course that I offer here at the college, and some of my students I see here today. And it is that work on North American pilgrims which will be the basis of today's talk. So she'll be speaking us today on Walking Where Jesus Walked, American Pilgrims in the Holy Land. But of course, her most recent work, and I want to bring attention to this, is that, of course, she just wrote a book on Christian globalism at home, child sponsorship in the U.S., and which just came out from Princeton University Press in 2020. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Kaell.
Thank you. All right, hold on. I need to turn myself on. There we go. Can you all hear me? Is that okay? Even in the back? Good, thank you. So I like how Professor Bacola just said, of course you all know that I've written more recently on the topic of NGOs. Well, you don't know that, probably, but it is somewhat relevant in the sense that the research that I'm talking about today is research that I did about 15 years ago. So sort of 20 years ago is when I started, 15 years ago is when I was really doing the research, and then this book came out almost 10 years ago that I'm talking about today. So all this to say that when I'm talking about statistics and I'm talking about some of the facets of this research, I am talking about things that are about 15 years old at this point. However, I'd be happy in the Q&A to also talk a little bit more about the present, if I'm able. Should I have both of these? Sorry, just speaking of technology, should I have both of these mics going? Doesn't matter. Okay, good. So, is what?
Is she able to use one mic or the other, or is one hooked up to the video?
I don't know. Yes, could I use one or the other? Oh, this one sounds way better. Should I just use this one then? Okay. I'm going to use that one. Oh, we're turning up the volume. Whoa, okay, that's very voluminous. Okay, is that a word? All right, great. Is that okay for, my goodness. Okay, is that all right for everyone now? Yeah? All right. So, about 200 million pilgrims travel each year around the world. And among these are 250,000 North American Christian visitors to the Holy Land, the biblical sites associated with Jesus' life and death. Pilgrimage is a $10 to $15 billion industry around the world, depending on how you do the accounting, and it's also deeply meaningful, varied, and ancient. So about 15 years ago, when I began studying contemporary pilgrimage, I was surprised to find that social scientists had almost exclusively used one model. Station oneself at a shrine or with a group and talk to pilgrims while they were abroad. They didn't work with pilgrims before the trips or after the trips, or certainly they did so very, very rarely. So I wanted to think more deeply about the people who chose to go to the Holy Land. Why did they go in the first place? What was their experience of being there, which is a more typical question in pilgrimage studies, right? Station yourself there. What's the experience while people are there? and I wanted to know about impacts of the trip upon return. So I started to think about pilgrimage as an ongoing process that unfolds over time rather than a single one-off event, which is often the way it had been viewed before. Now, another major gap in the scholarship on North American Holy Land pilgrimage in particular concerns Catholics. Studies focused, and still do focus, almost exclusively on Protestants, and more specifically Protestants of the evangelical variety. And indeed, evangelical Protestants do make up about 35% of the US Christian market in Israel, which is about commensurate with their population in the United States. And that is strange that they go, because Protestants, when they protested the Catholic Church in the 1500s, had expressly rejected what they dismissed as works, the kinds of stuff that Catholics could do to atone for sin, like, for example, giving to charity or going on a pilgrimage. The famous reformer Martin Luther even said that pilgrimage, quote, gave countless occasions to commit sin and to despise God's commandments. That is a pretty harsh evaluation of pilgrimage. So in short, Protestants didn't do pilgrimage. So then, why were North American evangelicals doing just that? But for me, another part of the question had to do with Catholics. About 25% of US Holy Land pilgrims are Catholics. Again, that's about commensurate with their population. So who were these Catholics who chose to go to the Holy Land instead of, or perhaps alongside, other possible pilgrimage sites like Lourdes or Fatima? And how did they compare to evangelicals who had been the focus of so many previous studies? So today what I want to talk to you about is a bit about those questions and some of the things that I found in my 5-year ethnographic study. And I want to highlight the role of Catholics, given where we are today at this college. So I'll speak first briefly about the tour industry, and then I want to turn to the pilgrims themselves. And I'm going to speak in really broad strokes, and that'll give us a chance, I hope, to have some discussion during the Q&A. So note down for yourself anything that you'd like to hear more about, and we can talk about that afterwards. Okay, but let's begin with just a few basics first. Okay, that's just the book upon which all of this is based. Okay, basics. So first, when I say the Holy Land, I'm using language that's common amongst the people with whom I worked, and it means a network of places, primarily associated with Jesus' life and death, and concentrated mainly in Jerusalem and around the Galilee. So if you look at this map that's right here, you can see that Jerusalem is the square that's between the orange that is Palestinian territory and the green that is Israeli territory, and then the Galilee is the sea that is north. I don't know if you can see that. It's right along this section called the Golan Heights. So those are really the two primary places where pilgrims who are on these types of tours are traveling and viewing things. After the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, most of these sites were incorporated into the New Kingdom of Jordan, the ones that were around Jerusalem. And then after the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, most of them came into Israel's hands, where they remain today. But major exceptions to that are Bethlehem and Jericho, which are located in Palestine. Over the same period, North American Holy Land tours changed significantly. The early 20th century clientele of these kinds of trips were upper middle class, mainly men, Euro-American Protestants from the urban Northeast. And they traveled in quite small groups generally. You needed a lot of money and you needed a lot of time to be able to go to the Holy Land in this period because it was by steamship travel. So you needed to be able to have at least 3 to 4 weeks that you could take for your trip to the Holy Land, and you needed to be able to pay for it, which was many months, if not a year's salary for the average worker in the United States or Canada in the 1920s. Now, this demographic changed quite dramatically after the Second World War. In general, American international travel spiked by 700% after the Second World War. This was driven by white Americans benefiting from post-war wealth, a strong dollar, and the rise of middle-class vacation and leisure culture in general. By the 1960s, the majority of US Holy Land pilgrims, about 85% based on my research, were between the ages of 55 and 75, and about 70% were women. And this is the population that we also continue to see basically from the 1960s through to the present. They varied considerably in social class compared to their predecessors before the Second World War, and also varied in terms of geographic location. And much more than their predecessors, they also traveled in groups. 89% of Christian Holy Land pilgrims travel in groups today, compared to 36% of other US tourists abroad. So in other words, going in a group is a really big part of pilgrimage. It's something that people are looking for. The trips that North Americans take since airplane travel became the norm are between 9 and 12 days. They travel by tour bus led by a local guide and a North American pastor or priest. And I only worked with Christian tours of the standard variety. So what I mean are general trips that were advertised somewhat broadly and fit the general criteria I just noted. I did not examine trips for university credit, for example, or specialized trips related to volunteerism. That might have drawn a different group of people, maybe a younger group of people, for example. I didn't look at those trips. Let's talk for a moment about the tour industry. And this is sort of the typical tours that I was studying. So the tour industry, scholars talk about 20th century US Holy Land tours, again, always of the evangelical variety, as though they burst fully formed onto the international stage in the 1970s. Evangelicals notice Israel in 1967, they get excited about it, and then they all start suddenly going on tours. Or some other scholars of a more historical bent might say, well, look, they were actually a continuation of Protestant tours in the late 19th century. People like Mark Twain or President Ulysses S. Grant, right, go on Holy Land tours. And that in the 1970s, these mass tours that are going on tour buses are just an extension of what we've seen before. In fact, telling that story, I think, means that you have to completely ignore Catholics, which is precisely what most scholars have done. So as most of you are probably aware, in the last half of the 19th century, the number of Catholics in North America, and especially in the United States, expanded greatly. And with that growth came institution building. So in 1880, the Franciscan Commissariat, that's the Vatican's Holy Land custodians since the 14th century, established a US branch. As elsewhere, their mandate was to promote the Holy Land. To this end, in 1889, its priests organized the first North American Catholic pilgrimage. This was a trip that drew mainly urban, upper middle class clientele. So in other words, not so different in terms of demography than the Protestants, who were also able to take this trip in the late 19th century. After World War I, something changes. Independent, New York-based Catholics, lay people, begin to organize small pilgrimage companies. So companies that are going to specialize in running pilgrimage for Catholics. And as I was poring over newspapers, looking at all of their advertisements, looking at who's going on these tours, what I realized is that they were specializing ethnically. So two of the main companies operating out of New York, and New York is the center for all of these companies in this period, are Beccari Catholic Tours, organized by an Italian immigrant named F.M. Beccari, and Transmarine Tours, headed by Thomas Broderick, a New York-born Irish Catholic. Beccari is organizing tours for an Italian market, and Broderick is putting together trips for Irish parishes. The link between these early intra-ethnic companies and US evangelicals comes from a really unlikely source, a Greek Orthodox immigrant named Pano Anastasato. How is my mic, by the way? Is it okay? All right. I'm hearing myself. It sounds very loud, but if you guys are good with it, then good. Okay, so Pano Anastasato. In the early 1950s, he secured a job working with airlines promoting Catholic pilgrimages to the Holy Land. That was his whole job, get Catholics on board these new planes, this new technology, and get them to the Holy Land. Observing how these pilgrimages were organized, he saw a major business opportunity. he offered to run a Holy Land tour for a nationally renowned Protestant fundamentalist pastor in Oklahoma. And when he did so, Anastasado adopted what I think of as a Catholic model. These are models that he had learned from these Catholic pilgrimage companies, and he transports it into the fundamentalist Protestant market. This model was a male religious leader who leads his flock, not just a tour guide, but the male religious leader, the pastor, would also go with the group. Simple accommodations in the Holy Land, and also breaks throughout the day for worship. Now, Catholics, and still today when they're on a tour, are going to stop every day, at least once a day, and hold Mass, and often take the Eucharist. And this will happen every day of the tour, usually. Protestants, and I think in large part due to Anastasado using this model, will also break throughout the day for worship. Normally on the trips that I was on, they'll take communion maybe twice while they're in the Holy Land, certainly once, maybe twice. It depends on how Eucharistically oriented they are as Protestants. But still, some of these folks are from churches where they might take communion only once in a whole year normally. So while they're in the Holy Land, the fact that they do take communion once or at least twice is it's a marked event. And again, this breaking constantly for worship at the sites themselves is something that Anastasado grabs from the Catholic model of pilgrimage that he's looking at. So the gap he noticed in the Protestant market in this period in the 1960s was not surprising. Although not adverse to Holy Land tourism, Reformed Protestants, as I mentioned, had no pilgrimage tradition of their own upon which to draw. But like Catholics and white Americans more generally, many of them were benefiting from post-war wealth and an expanded vacation and leisure culture. So the time was ripe, and Anastasado seized his chance. By the 1970s, he controlled perhaps 80% of the evangelical market, and he trained the people, importantly, who still run many of the major evangelical tour companies today. So his influence was major on this market. Now, a Greek Orthodox man using Catholic models to set up an evangelical tour industry is unexpected to say the least, and it certainly helps complicate any story about North American Holy Land pilgrimage that ignores Catholics or understands there to be some kind of uncrossable line between Protestant and Catholic markets, which is often assumed. Okay, let's turn to the Pilgrims and why they go. So who are they and why are they going halfway across the world to the Holy Land? We need to contextualize Holy Land travel historically. Now, while Christians have been making the trip for nearly 2,000 years, we have pretty good records going back to about 300, 400 years after Jesus to show that they're making pilgrimages to Jerusalem. But that's not the history that I'm talking about. I am actually talking about the history of the kind of accessible tours that I've been talking about here, that, as I've implied, are a much more recent phenomenon. Now, a trend in academic work on the Second Ecumenical Vatican Council, or Vatican II, I'm going to assume you know what that is. If you don't, please ask in the Q&A, or ask the person next to you. So a trend in work on the Second Vatican Council in the early 1960s shows that how the council's reception amongst lay people was affected by social and economic changes that had only tenuous or no connections to the church itself. And this is really important, I think. So for example, historians are saying, look, when lay Catholics in North America are understanding the council and they're putting it into practice in their lives, they're also viewing it as entangled with other kinds of trends, like, let's say, the rise of feminism or civil rights in the same period. Well, one of the trends that we've been talking about is that Vatican II coincided with that overseas travel boom in North America that I've been talking about. So that's a major reason why North Americans felt that they wanted to, and that, in fact, they could go to the Holy Land in this period. But why the Holy Land? And that's where the Second Vatican Council comes into play as a theological watershed in the history of Catholicism. It privileged a more engaged, personal Catholicism amongst laity. So laity are people who are not priests or religious sisters. So that personal engaged Catholicism, and it even described lay people, regular folks, as having a vocation, which was a very new kind of language and a new way to think about lay people's faith. And that kind of engagement is important. So one couple, I call Frank and Janine, are typical. Like most pilgrims, when I met them, they were in their mid-60s and they attended church regularly. They lived near Boston. And before we embarked on the trip, we met to talk about why they chose to go. So Janine said, "We started a layperson's Bible study 12 years ago. It's something our parents never would have done. Now I think I'm ready to be in the Holy Land because we've been doing Bible study for so long." And Frank agreed, adding that the other Holy Land trip he took in 1999, which was an add-on to a business trip, which is why Janine hadn't been with him, it made him committed to studying scripture. He said, "Having had that good experience, I felt and I still feel a calling, like a ministry, to pass on the value of studying the Bible." He doesn't use the term vocation, but it is that kind of feeling that he's describing. So in my sample of ethnographic interviews with Catholic pilgrims, that was about 60 or so people. I was working with Protestants as well, but so 60 or so of the people with whom I worked before, during, and after the trips were Catholics. About 66% of them had been involved in an ongoing Bible study within a decade of taking the trip, and for most, it had been within the last couple years. And a separate 20% were daily Bible readers on their own. So in other words, 85+% of people who were choosing to go on this trip had a really intimate connection with the Bible. In comparison, surveys at the time in the same diocese that I was working in showed that only 27% of Mass-going US Catholics had ever attended a Bible study. That's quite a lot, by the way, I should say, if we were to compare that to a previous generation, but it's not a lot if we compare it to the number of people choosing to go to the Holy Land and their connection to Scripture in that way. Okay, so the Holy Land draws Catholics who are devoted regular communicants, but also Jesus-centered and Scripture-focused. And these Catholics do not view the Holy Land as the same as other pilgrimages. In fact, many of them have also gone, or maybe not many, but some certainly have also gone on other pilgrimages, especially to Marian sites. And they associate these sites often with physical and emotional healing, or with ties to ethnic backgrounds. So Janine is Irish, for example, and she really wanted to go to Ireland and also visit Marian sites while she was there. So this is something that I hear typically. But they never go to the Holy Land for those reasons. They don't go to the Holy Land for healing, and they don't go because they have some kind of ethnic tie to the Holy Land. They go to grow in their faith, as they often put it, by choosing to emphasize Jesus and Scripture. This idea of choice and growth featured strongly in the homilies delivered by our tour leader, Father Mike. Take, for example, his message when our group visited the cave where Jerome is believed to have written the Latin Vulgate Bible. Oops. So the Vulgate is a bit of an ambivalent symbol, or at least it certainly was on this trip, since it was a vernacular text when written. It was in the language that people spoke when it was written, yet it is in Latin, which is a language that the Pilgrims associate with the preconciliar Mass, because it's no longer their vernacular language, of course. So Father Mike, though, chose to ignore the Latin bit and focus on the vernacular quality. As we stood there, he said, "Most of us did not learn the Bible, but this is a renewal for us to learn the Bible. They say that in the Reformation, we kept the Eucharists and gave the Protestants the Bible. Well, imagine if that were reversed. If we took the Bible back and we'll give the Protestants the Eucharist." For Father Mike and many of the pilgrims, the trip is a chance to actively move into the present. As a result, they contrast choice and spiritual activity and their interpretive authority with what they see as the passivity of their childhood faith, symbolized by the rote memorization of the catechism. It means putting away childish things. Most Bible study groups define getting to know Scripture as reading the whole texts, not just the parts one likes best. And even Mary plays a lesser role if one studies the texts systematically. And this is no easy task. Father Mike says, "I tell my parishioners all the time that having a personal relationship with Jesus isn't Protestant, it's Catholic. But some pilgrims are so afraid, they don't even bring a Bible on the trip." Though Catholic clergy have, in fact, emphasized that the Bible is the common heritage of all Christians for decades, The Bible has been a potent symbol of what made Protestants Protestant. Teresa, the tour company owner who ran the trip I've been talking about, recalled, "When I first opened my Bible to read, my mother said, 'What are you doing? Are you going to become a Baptist or something?' Such worries persist. Even today, or at least when I was doing my research 10 years ago, popular Catholic magazines reassured readers that Bible study does not lead to, quote, Protestant fundamentalism. For Mike and his group, the discourse he uses, being in control, being spiritual adults, it's freeing for many of them. But for other people on that trip and on other trips, it can be upsetting, particularly if extra textual devotions to saints or to the Virgin Mary are described condescendingly as immature or childish, which they sometimes are. So it can create a subtle tension between pilgrims on the same trips, but also a tension for individuals. Janine, for example, is deeply devoted to the Virgin Mary, as well as being Bible-focused. So my view is that the Holy Land trips are powerful precisely because in many ways they succeed in mediating these tensions. It's an opportunity for Catholics to be biblically focused, yet the trips remain largely free of discomforting associations with Protestantism because they are long-standing devotions associated with the Franciscans. And in practical terms, this mediation is expressed as Catholic pilgrims move between emphasizing the Bible at certain sites and the land as a proof text for biblical truths, and more traditional devotions that include extra textual aspects. So for example, doing the Stations of the Cross and emphasizing Mary's role in that capacity. And something I noticed on Father Mike's group when we did the Stations of the Cross together is that women, including Janine, carried rosaries and whispered prayers and talked a lot about the generations that had walked the Stations of the Cross in their parishes with them when they were young. So their sort of the experience of being a child in a Catholic parish connected to previous generations became a really positive thing and was incorporated into the trip. Okay, so I want to talk just a bit about gender. I've been talking about a productive tension, I think, on these Catholic trips. But there's another tension, and I saw it on all North American trips, Protestant and Catholic. And this tension is between commercialization, as pilgrims often put it, and religion. Now, I should say, many scholars, myself included, emphasize how commercial activity and religion are always entangled. There's no paradox there. However, classical studies of Western Christian pilgrimage also assumed that it was voluntary, individualistic, and a journey in liminal space away from the everyday. And that assumption is still really prevalent in studies on the topic. So obviously something being commercial, i.e. you can purchase it, is not quite the same as something being voluntary, i.e. not obligatory, individualistic and disengaged from the everyday. However, there are uncomfortable associations for pilgrims. It seems that one might be acting individualistically by purchasing a self-indulgent tour. So in other words, pilgrims are quite concerned about the connection between commercial availability, self-indulgence, and individualism. They talk a lot about how these things might interact, and there's no way to fully dissolve the tension. The pilgrimage industry, as it operates today, is a direct outcome of a more commercialized, purchasable, and individualized type of religious experience. It does offer a personal experience for lay people if they can afford it. For post-Vatican II Catholics like Frank and Janine, one solution is to strongly emphasize that the trip is no mere vacation. It is not a commercialized leisure activity, but rather it's part of an ongoing religious journey where they are progressing as spiritual adults who make choices about their faith. So here choice becomes different than a commercial choice. It becomes part of a spiritual choosing that happens over and over again over a lifetime. One might pay for one's choice, of course, but one is still choosing it nonetheless. Now, Protestants don't use this particular narrative, but they, along with their Catholic counterparts, also contest a view of the trip as self-indulgent, leisure, and individualistic, or separate from home ties. So this idea that the pilgrimage is somehow a rupture from the everyday, which is that this classic scholarly model, is something that pilgrims continually push back against. So in other words, pilgrims would say that scholars who assume that a Western Christian pilgrim is acting as an individual to leave home and reverse the bonds and obligations of everyday life, that those scholars are in fact just wrong, is probably how they would put it. And this has a lot to do with women. As I noted, about 70% of Holy Land pilgrims are women aged 55 to 75. When men go, they almost always accompany a woman, usually a wife or a mother. But women will go alone or with their friends or their parish, even if their husbands refuse to go. And it's true that pilgrimage is expensive. It's often the single biggest travel expenditure these pilgrims will ever make. And it's voluntary. No Christian needs to take a pilgrimage. But pilgrims push back strongly against the implication that it is therefore individualistic, even if they happen to embark on the trip alone. So once I began to talk to them in depth about why they wanted to go, most emphasized a number of goals related to relational networks. Women in particular frame the trip as an extension of their existing role as spiritual expert in their families and communities. A spiritual expert is an anthropological term. None of them call themselves spiritual experts, I should clarify. But what they did talk about is how they pray for others on a regular basis, how they support others in their spiritual journey. The pilgrimage is a logical extension of their everyday spiritual work. Now, men were a lot more likely to tell me they were going because they were interested in history or politics. Women never told me this. And this difference reflects how gender roles are construed, and also the everyday realities of how these women, again aged 55 to 75, as mothers, grandmothers, wives, friends, and parishioners, are deeply involved in spiritually supporting others. And one other thing I want to mention in this respect is that pilgrims rarely go to the Holy Land because they personally are in need of something. In fact, they will tell me that other people in their lives might need healing or a boost in their faith, for example, but they themselves feel very close to God. They sometimes call it a high point in their faith when they decide to embark on the trip. So they want to deepen what they already view as very solid. Let's turn for a moment, I realize I'm running out of time here, but let's turn to for a moment to what people encounter in the Holy Land itself. I'll note just a couple aspects. During the trip, pilgrims encounter few Israelis and even fewer Palestinians. Most are not bothered by the separation from the local population because the trip, from their perspective, is meant to serve a very specific purpose: to deepen their relationship to Jesus and Scripture. They want to imaginatively immerse themselves in Jesus' day, not learn about contemporary politics and culture. So guides, both Israeli and Palestinian, work hard to translate potentially disruptive encounters with locals into this biblical narrative. And by disruptive, I don't necessarily mean bad. Disruptive can actually sometimes be really good. It can be really fun. It can be diverting. But the issue is that it's disruptive to the biblical narrative. So guides are constantly working to translate those moments into this larger narrative about the Bible. And they're usually successful, at least if they're good. The guides are successful at doing this. So, for example, when vendors stop pilgrims at the doors of their buses, for example, guides will work this into a discussion about the money changers at the temple and the emotions that Jesus may have felt at the time. So the idea is to always bring pilgrims back to this feeling of experiencing the Bible and drawing closer to Jesus. And when moments work in this way, they can become really powerful memories for people. And when they don't work in this way, pilgrims tend to forget them as interruptions to the tour, and it's not part of the stories that they tell after the trip. But it's more complicated than simply Christian sites associated with Jesus, work for pilgrims, and sites with encounters with contemporary locals require translations. Rather, pilgrims are always discerning which biblically oriented sites in the Holy Land feel right to them. By right, I mean worshipful with a sense of other than human presence, the presence of God, the presence of deceased loved ones, the presence of Mary, and which sites do not create that sense of presence. And part of that has to do with aesthetics and the organization of the site, as well as the other pilgrimage groups who are there on the site with whom a group might be interacting. So for example, the Jordan River. I'll give you just one example. Nearly all groups access the Jordan through Yardenit. It's a kibbutz-run site that was built to cater to the evangelical Protestant market, but Catholics access the site through it as well. Pilgrims file in and out through a gift shop, and prominently displayed are photos of celebrity visitors, and all of them are U.S. televangelists or megachurch pastors. It can rub a lot of pilgrims the wrong way, especially Catholics. On another Catholic trip I was on, Ed and Nadine, a couple in their mid-70s, looked around with me, commenting, "It's like a trailer park at Disney World." They were not being very nice. I would not have used that language. It's like a trailer park Disney World, and you go through the gift shop, of course. For Catholics, Yardenit is often the most significant point during the trip when Protestants are in the majority and the site is geared to them. When the impression is negative, it's often conflated with and exacerbated by the site's commercial aspect. So I want to emphasize that all U.S. pilgrims, Protestant and Catholic, use the word commercial, not necessarily to mean that money is changing hands, although sometimes it is, but mainly to signify what they feel is ineffective spiritually. So sometimes you'll be at a site where there is no actual commerce being had, and someone will tell me the site is commercialized as far as they're concerned, right? So it's shorthand that Americans use as part of sort of the North American vernacular, you might say, to talk about something that's ineffective and what they view as the opposite of what they would call often an authentic spiritual experience. So making distinctions between commercial and authentic throughout the trip is an extension of the tension expressed before the trip as they grapple with the fact that a tour is actually inherently a commercial endeavor and yet also a spiritual one, and their concern with how to sort out that tension for themselves as well as how it may be perceived by family and friends. And this concern about the commercial also speaks to something quite specific about the Holy Land. This particular pilgrimage, and this is not the case with Marian shrines in the same way, this particular pilgrimage is premised on a belief that arose in the 19th century but is inherited by Western Christian pilgrims. This belief that the land's value lies in how its physical geography at a basic level is unchanged. Sometimes people shorthand this as the fifth gospel. Now, no one who I was working with on these Catholic tours talked about the fifth gospel, but I put it up here just because it's kind of, I think, a nice way to encapsulate what I'm saying. So, this idea that at a basic level, the geography remains unchanged, and thus one can walk where Jesus did, one can hear him better and feel his presence in this place that is unchanged. But this idea that the land is basically unchanged and thus of spiritual value, ironically, is what led to a mass tourism, or helped promote, certainly, a mass tourist industry among Western Christians. And yet, not only was the land never static, of course, but the irony lies in how the mass tourist industry, its buses, its facilities, its highways, does continually disrupt the fantasy that brings Western pilgrims in the first place. So this particular trip has this major tension embedded within it, unchangingness, and then the actual, that brings the tourists, and then the actual facilities needed to cater to those tourists once they get there. What I found is that ultimately, when sites clash with expectations in any way, pilgrims begin to see its construction, and that's what some of them then call commercialized. But when they feel a connection to the place, they're able to brush it aside. And this also makes a difference after the trip as memories are solidified. And I should just note that on Ed and Nadine's Catholic trip, for example, there were in fact people who really enjoyed Yardenit. One pilgrim, Ella, on that trip, commented that she just thought it was lovely. She found a quiet corner, she said, that reminded her just of the garden that they had at their parish church, and she was able to pray there and really feel a sense of presence in that site. All that stuff just faded away, Ella said, once she found her spot. So this brings me to my last point. All American pilgrims, whether Catholic or Protestant, define authentic sites as those that felt right, meaning that, as I said, they produced a sense of spiritual presence. And that this is just as, or even more, I would argue, important a marker than, say, what is verifiable archaeologically or biblically. The kind of scientific proof that guides and scholars and the Israeli Ministry of Tourism so often promote. And in general, the most spiritually powerful places have a really specific profile. They are just different enough to evoke somewhere where Jesus might have walked, and yet just similar enough to evoke home, and thus a sense that this is a place where the sacred resides. And the reason that I have a picture here of the interior of the Church of St. Anne, which is a Crusader church, and not a biblical site, is just to mention that when I stepped into this church with an African American Methodist, so this is a Protestant woman, and this was not on our tour because it's not biblical, but we stepped into it and she was just overcome. And she said, now this is a place where Jesus and Mary must have been. And the reason that she felt that way, she told me, is that it's quite simple, the aesthetics. It reminded her of her church at home. And when we walked in, right at that same moment, there was an American Catholic group sitting in the pews singing hymns in English that felt to her like it transported her to her home church. And yet, as we sat there and then we made the tour around and we touched all the stone that's obviously clearly very ancient, it felt to her like an incredibly ancient site where Jesus might have been. So this combination of home, site, and also just different enough to evoke where Jesus might have been, that's the sweet spot. That's the profile of an authentic site. So I am going to end there, and I'll just end by saying, like a good anthropologist, that often what we do as anthropologists is we pull out these kinds of tensions and contrasts and try to think about how these play out in real people's lives. So that's what I've been demonstrating for you here today. What I mean when I say that the trip mediates these is not that the trip solves any of these tensions. They continue to reside and I think are inherent to the trip itself, but rather Pilgrims are able, by contrasting experiences, by sort of remembering certain things and maybe kind of sublimating or backgrounding certain things, are able to make the trip into a coherent and important experience for themselves. I'll end there, and we have a bit of time for questions.
Okay, please join me in thanking I'm cognizant that some of you have classes to get to, so feel free to, top up your tea and coffee and head to your class as you need. But we do have an opportunity for some questions, and if you're a student, I don't want you to feel you can't ask a question. So maybe you've wondered about something, maybe something from the talk today made you question something about Holy Land pilgrimage. Please feel free to raise your hand, and we're really open to hearing your thoughts.
Yes?
Talk about different motivations that Catholics have to learn the pilgrimage, some confusion that they have. Has the Catholic Church addressed the pilgrimage at all to help maybe give some guidance to what Catholics think about it?
Well, so not the Catholic, the Catholic Church is a big entity, obviously, but the Franciscan Commissariat, so those are the Vatican-appointed custodians, as I mentioned, and they have been for 600 years. So they are constantly producing materials to help Catholics in many, many languages, to help Catholics understand this trip. And in fact, something that the Vatican negotiated with Israel after 1967 was that Catholics, along with the Orthodox, but they negotiated separately with the State of Israel, that the Catholic Franciscan Commissariat could license their own guides. So in other words, Catholics actually are in a different position than Protestants because they can go to the Holy Land and never have an Israeli ministry certified guide on their bus, but they can have a Franciscan certified guide on their bus. Now, there are not really enough Franciscan certified guides to go around, so that's not always possible, it's not always the case, but certainly the fact that the Franciscan Commissariat retains control over their own licensing process means, and they actually train Protestant pastors, which I find fascinating. So that means that they retain some control over how they are shaping the, sort of the way that the pilgrimage is understood, much more so than other tourists might be able to exert.
And
Yeah.
nothing has been said is
No, not about how you must understand the Holy Land. No. Yeah.
Other questions or comments? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I'm wondering how the research you did on this topic informs your more recent work of looking at Christians, Protestants, and Catholics in North America.
Oh yeah, great. Yes, I love questions that allow me to talk more about the present. Yeah, so the last project I was working on, which is actually finished now as well, I'm working on a different project at this point, but the last project that I was working on was about NGOs, and the connection between those two projects is that one of the reasons, really the main reason actually I came to this project is that I wanted to think about the way that we as scholars, I suppose, but also as humans, think about the connections between religion and global imaginaries or globalization. And one of the things that I noticed in the scholarship in that period was that the vast majority of studies on North American religion and global movement of people had to do either with missionaries or with immigrants and migrants. So in other words, people who were going somewhere for a very long time. Whereas what I was really interested in is, so what about people who maybe haven't really left North America often or at all, even before making this trip, but have been picturing this place over and over again, and even enacting it. Like lots of pilgrims told me about dressing up in bathrobes and sandals, when they were kids, about nativity plays and things like that. So, what is it like to go to a place that you've actually been picturing imaginatively in a number of ways, and if you've been doing Bible study, for example, and to only go there, though, for a very short period, and then to have a very long period, of course, once you get back, in order to assimilate and kind of think about that experience. That was the main thing that interested me originally in this project. And the NGO project is about people who, Christians who are trying to create a sense of global connectedness to children who they are sponsoring through either Catholic or evangelical organizations. And in that case, it's taking it even a step further, because those folks are never going to the sites that they're trying to picture. They're never meeting the person who they understand to be connected to them through this process. So again, to try to think about how can we abstract a little bit out from this question about globalization and religion in order to talk about how people imagine and create certain kinds of networks globally. Yeah, so that's the connection. Yeah, and my current project is actually about hurricanes, and that's even abstracting it one step further, because what I'm interested in is hurricanes that start off the coast of Africa and then move across the Atlantic, hit the Caribbean, and then often the coast of the United States. So here we have people being involved in a global process, but it's actually really the wind and air particles that is the globally moving force, whereas the people themselves are staying in place. So again, this kind of question about how can we reimagine what we think of as global factors that affect people's religion here in North America.
Just curious. Pilgrimage is usually always expensive.
Mm-hmm.
But with the assisted network, is there a way for a poor recent graduate to do a pilgrimage, or is it kind of that tour bus style? You got to book the thing?
Well, as I said, I looked at what I would call a standard pilgrimage. So these are the vast majority of the kinds of trips that people take. And there's a set price, at the time that I was doing it, the cheapest you could probably find would be $3,500. I'm sure that's a lot more expensive now as well. So that's like pretty standard But that said, I mean, there are a certain number of people who would individually consider themselves pilgrims and might be, say, backpacking. That would be a cheaper way to do things. And there are, of course, other kinds of trips that, as I said, are more likely to draw young people. Let's say doing something for university credit, in which case I don't know what the costs would be, and in fact, that might be something that...
I think last time the college arranged one.
Yeah.
It was, I think, 2018 or 2017 to the Holy Land. And
How much was it?
Yeah, 3,800.
3,800. See, that's quite cheap in 2018.
And that
so
was in
that's
2018. So
That's
yeah.
obviously not including airfare, right?
No.
Oh,
airfare.
that wasn't including
No,
airfare.
that wasn't including airfare.
Okay, so when I was going, 3,500 included airfare.
Okay.
Yes. And I know what the cheapest trips were because I was looking for cheap trips because I was a poor graduate student trying to study these things. Yes.
Well, we'll have to contact you next time we offer that. I see we've run out of time, and so I'm really cognizant about that, but Dr. Kaell is around for a few minutes if you want to ask a quick question or a comment before I whisk her off elsewhere. Thank you so much for coming today. Please ensure that you top up your tea and coffee and clear out those muffins on your way to your other classes and organizations. And I'll look forward to seeing you at our January lunch hour lecture. Will be January the 18th at noon in another room because we have a virtual speaker from St. Francis Xavier University on the East Coast. Dr. Donna Travinsky will be talking about disability as a lens to review the lives and experiences of St. Francis of Assisi. So I really look forward to seeing you then. But for today, please join me in thanking Dr. Kaell.
Thanks, everyone. And I'm going to be right here, so please don't hesitate. I'm just going to be sitting here sipping coffee. Come speak to me if you would like.